¿Aló? Sí. Hola. Muchas gracias por la invitación. I will speak in English for our guests that don't have translation. So, but I have pictures and drawings, so even if it's not perfect, I'll try to go around. So let's start with cities. The title was how the city of the future is going to look like. Well, cities are good news and bad news. You know, we live in an urban age. In 2007, we crossed the threshold for the first time in mankind history of having more people living in cities than on the countryside. And this, in principle, is good news. Even if counterintuitive, all the data shows that people is better off in cities than outside of them. To deliver public policies is more efficient if people is concentrated in space, child mortality, access to education, to sanitation. Also, not just for the poor people, but for the creation of wealth, of the critical mass that cities provide, cities are good news. But they're at the same time bad news because of what we call the 3S menace: scale, speed, and scarcity of means with which we will have to respond to this phenomenon of people moving towards cities looking for opportunities. And I'm talking about a pace of 1 million people per week, to which we will have to respond with $10,000 in the next 10 years. These people moving towards cities are coming at a pace of 1 million per week. So we need to build a Valparaíso a week in order to accommodate people coming to cities. If we don't do that, if we don't find a way to solve this equation, it is not that people will stop coming to cities. They will come anyhow, but they will live in very bad conditions. So this is a very difficult question to solve, and if we do not solve it, then we have a problem of political, social, security threats. People will accumulate pressure in cities as if it's a ticking time bomb because of the poor living conditions, of the inequalities, of the segregation that cities manifest very concretely. It's not an abstract thing we experience in everyday life, and this is the case of Santiago, most the case of the poor countries in the world, and the 2 billion people moving to cities are going to be mainly in between the tropics in the poorest countries of the world. So if we don't solve that, we will have a social political crisis. But if we find a way, if we're lucky, if we invest a lot of knowledge in trying to find how to build fast with quality, so if we do solve this equation with the known building methods that we have today, the carbon footprint of building with the way we're building cities nowadays, without inventing anything, will end with the planet. We will create not only an environmental crisis, but we know that migrations, for example, and security or insecurity is associated to climate change. We will end up, in the case we found a way to build so fast and so massively, with the same kind of threats that we're facing if we don't solve this. So we're in a kind of catch-22 situation where if we don't solve it, we have a problem, and if we do solve it with the means we know today, we have a problem too. So what to do? Well, somewhere here, cities themselves are a kind of shortcut towards equality. They can improve quality of life and correct inequalities if we do well in housing, in infrastructure, in public space, in transportation, in institutional civic buildings. So normally we've been building cities by silos, in Spanish, sectorialmente, by sectors. But the challenge of the city of the future and the scarcest resource of the city of the future is not going to be so much money, but coordination. Not anymore we will have to build infrastructure or public space or housing. We will have to find a way to build all of them at the same time. What Nishizawa showed in the first picture is a city where you could not recognize what was center, what was periphery. This is a challenge that we're facing, and we'll be facing even more so in the coming future. Somewhere here, to correct the carbon footprint, if we put here, let's say, the high-tech, and somewhere here, the low-tech, well, the carbon footprint in between this and that won't make it. So we will have to move to somewhere here to the uber-tech, and somewhere here to the no-tech. So solution to correct the building methods that we are using today may come from plastics, from 3D printing, from robotics, from recycling efficiently with new science, what we have already, with all the materials that have embedded energy today, or to move to materials that require no technology, sand, earth, reed, bamboo, or recycling again. Somewhere here and there, we will find a way. So today, we in the office at the Elemental are trying to find the way to make, even if it's tiny contributions, what we do somewhere here or there, and I will show just 2 projects that are trying to address this challenge. So regarding people moving towards cities, we in Chile, of course, have no so visibly this kind of problems, even though in the backyards of the majority of our cities, this is how cities look like. So we have a huge shortage of housing that we need to build fast. This is a picture when we did our first project in 2003. This was the alternative in Alto Hospicio. We were trying to build in the center of Iquique in Alto Hospicio. With the subsidies of the state, you could build this, which in time evolved like this. So on paper, people got a house. In reality, what you got is segregated from opportunities, far away, creating resentment, insecurity, violence. No wonder then we're dealing with the social ticking time bomb. So our point was, is it possible within the same set of constraints to build in the center of the city so that people are not segregated in far away, underserved peripheries? And for $7,500, 300 UF, for which we had to buy the land 3 times more expensive. That's why we can't build social housing in the centers of cities, because land is so expensive. We found a way through design to achieve enough density without overcrowding in low height, so no maintenance, no vertical ghettos as we know it in Chile, so that we could pay expensive land and still provide people a solution. What was our approach? Well, evidence shows that a middle-class family lives reasonably well in around 80 square meters. All of us can live well in around 80 square meters. But when there's not enough money, and this is the case for 2 billion people in the world, in average, in the world, with public policies, what we can deliver is around 40. And markets and governments translate the lack of money into small houses. We can't build enough, so we built a tiny 40 square meter house. So we thought, can we, accepting those constraints and desirable evidence that a middle class requires around 80, and rethink of those 40, not as a small house, but as half of a good one? So these are 40 square meters as well. The same 40 square meters, but they're half of that good house that is by definition a public policy. Focus on what people cannot do well on their own, and instead of trying to resist self-construction. Instead of looking at slums and informal settlements as part of the problem, can we channel that capacity as part of the solution? Instead of replacing that capacity of people or trying to neglect it, can we accept that, frame it properly, and through design, use that energy as part of the solution? So the second half of the house, we know, if we make a calculation, I was just trying to do it in this Congress of astronomers and scientists, big numbers tend to be normal, not the case for us architects. We will need more or less 500 million households for the 2 billion people moving to cities. At 80 square meters, this is, I don't even know what this kind of number is, scientists may help, 40,000 billions square meters. That's how much we need to build. But half of those, 20,000 billion square meters, are not going to be built by states of markets, but by people themselves. If we don't use that capacity, we won't ever, never be able to find a solution for that X. So that's what we tried to channel, use design to channel that people's capacity, and because they stayed in the center where there were the opportunities, they kept their jobs, and then they could invest in a house that now belongs to them. That was our first project in the north, and with that same scheme, not going to go into too much detail. We were able to produce a household that today, if you go to the market, because people now own that house, it started with $7,500. Nowadays, if you want to buy one of those, it's $70,000. So that's the first time we have changed the trend of looking at social housing not as a social expense, but as a social investment. By definition, all of us, when buy a house, expect to grow its value over time. And that should be the case for the people that need the value gain the most, which is the poor people that may use their household, not just as a shelter against the environment, but as a tool to overcome poverty. And with that value gain that we have been systematically trying to find different designs, both in Chile or elsewhere, even after the reconstruction of the earthquake and tsunami in the north of Chile, we've been trying to use people's informal construction as part of the solution and not as part of the problem. Last project we are trying to implement in Buenos Aires for a slum of 15,000 people. So that's one thing that we've been trying to do around housing, how to use design to change the current situation, accepting the constraints. Another one, which is the last project we have on the drawing board in the office, is the new offices for the IDB, the BID, the bank in Buenos Aires, that if this was business as usual, the bank would have buy a site or buy a building in any of the financial districts of Buenos Aires. But in a very bold move, the president of the bank, Luis Alberto Moreno, said, what if by doing our own building, we try to trigger the same amount of development that we ask to the projects that we finance? We are a bank, true, but we're a development bank. How should we be doing this differently? So by doing our headquarters, can we change the social situation of the projects the same way we ask different projects that we finance anywhere in Latin America to do the same? And the most emblematic project they were financing was the upgrading of Villa 31. Those who know Buenos Aires, it's 50,000 people living in between Retiro and Recoleta in the most well-located part of Buenos Aires, 200 meters away of the most expensive square meter of Buenos Aires, where all the workforce of Buenos Aires lives here, but is somehow neglected in between the railroads and the port. Those people, every single day, and just you may know those that go through Aeroparque to Buenos Aires, go through this highway that then transforms into 9 de Julio. You are driving actually on top of Villa 31. half of those 50,000 people are immigrants. So pretty much discussions that we recognize all over in the world are quite common. Not living just around the highway, but underneath the highway in very complicated situations, drug dealing issues and narco traffic and all that kind of thing. Those people, those 50,000 people nowadays, to go to work have just one entry point. If you stand in front of the Retiro train station, to your right, one single entry point. And to go to work, they spend 1 hour walking. They can't even afford public transportation. They have to walk. So, in addition to that, the project for the city was to eliminate barriers, eliminate the highway, to connect more the people. But the real barrier that had to be eliminated are the railroads. There's no connection. It's not possible nowadays to go across the railroads to access all the benefits and the opportunities that cities concentrate that are actually on Recoleta side. So our first approach was, the client was asking, can we do our building inside Barrio 31 so that we can bring some development or something? And we found out that we needed at least 4 conditions for that to deliver, to walk the talk. Otherwise, it's just wishful thinking. It's a kind of political gesture, but then doesn't produce any real impact. It would have needed to raise the building. The scarcest resource in slums is a public space. Manhattan has a proportion between private and private land of 1 to 1. Per 1 square meter of private land, there's 1 square meter of public space. If you put all the streets, sidewalks, squares, and of course, Central Park. In a slum, that proportion drops to less than 1 to 10. So the most valuable resource is public space, and it's crucial for improving people's quality of life, not so much at the private level, but at the public level. That's fundamental. So raise the building, also to gain views, ventilation and natural light, public space underneath, at least 2 car connections for security reasons. I'm not going to go into the details, but the security was a main issue here, and a pedestrian connection to the public transportation across the railroads. Of course, to ask for the city to these 4 conditions to even think about having a building there was complicated. They couldn't even afford to invest money outside Barrio 31 for legal reasons. So we thought, what if we think of this building of the bank, instead of 1 volume there and 4 conditions to ask somebody else, that the building itself solves the 4 conditions? What if the building itself is the bridge to connect both parts of the city with some public space on top? Of course, eliminating the barrier. So this is mainly a structural beam of 7 meter high, 240 meter long. In the center, because railroads can't be interrupted, there's a 110 meter span, no columns there. And in between the beam, then there's the bank. But then the bank, since it has to have a roof anyhow, has this public park on top that for free allows inhabitants of Villa 31 to connect to Recoleta. So if the situation today is that within 1 hour, this is the amount of opportunities of healthcare, education, culture, and recreation that people have, by having the bridge over there within that same 1 hour walk circle that makes a shortcut to 5 minutes, that access to opportunities is increased by 4. So if this is how it looks today, not a very nice place to work. It was not easy to convince the bank in Washington that this is the place where they were going to be working. But at some height, because we needed to have a free pass for highway and for trains, we had to go to 18 meter above. And at 18 meter, this is what appears. And of course, working in that situation was an easier sell to the bank. But what mainly was achieved here was all the rest of the opportunities that the bank was triggering while having this decision on top of the railways. And being in the former Congress, this is the first time I'm in this building, the relationship within politics is fundamental. Because for this project to happen, there was just one minor detail. The law had to be changed in order to use the air rights above the railroad. So everything worked fine. There's just this tiny detail. We had to go to the Congress and ask to change the law for using the air rights. And for the first time in a long period, I do not know Argentinian politics well enough, there was a possibility of a majority of voting because of the presidency of the country was also of the mayor of the city, Macri and Rodriguez Larreta were of the same coalition. So they thought they have an advantage of 2 votes to pass this law. Otherwise, projects tend to block each other. This was the history between city and nation in Buenos Aires. And to our surprise, in the first reading in November and in the second reading the week before Christmas, the law was changed and the building was approved 46-12. And I guess this kind of agreements is the kind of things that we will need in order to, what we architects can contribute with design has to have the rules of the game clear and efficient enough so that we are able to solve this equation. Thank you very much.